Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait for a few more participants to join us. We have a lot of people signed up for this afternoon. Okay, I can see a number of people coming in. Okay, we've got about 25 people now. We're up to 30. Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon on this warm spring day. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Ridgefield Library. My name is Lori McGavin Bachman, and I work in the Adult Programs Department here at the library. Our program today is the 6th in a series of 7 Ridgefield Pollinator Pathway series. There will be time for Q&A at the very end of this presentation. Tonight's guest presenter is Heather McCargo, founder of Wild Seed Project, a nonprofit organization based out of Portland, Maine, which encourages the use of native plants in all landscape settings to safeguard wildlife habitat, support biodiversity, and mitigate the effects of climate change. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Heather McCargo. Heather is an educator with more than 35 years of expertise in native plant propagation, landscape design, and conservation. In 2014, she launched Wild Seed Project, where she created a web-based resource to educate others about native plants and wild seed propagation. McCargo lectures nationally and is widely published in journals and magazines. Previous to her work at Wild Seed Project, she contributed to research projects, including the USAID Plants and Mountains and the National Gardening Association. She also designed the master plan for the medicinal gardens at Vervain Botanicals in Rockland, Maine. Heather has a BA in plant ecology from Hampshire College and an MA from the Conway School of Landscape Design. Will you please welcome Heather McCargo?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm pleased to be here. You left one piece out of my bio that affects this, which is I was the propagator at Garden in the Woods, the botanical garden of the Native Plant Trust in the 90s. That really relates to where I got a lot of deep experience and what I'm going to talk to today. So I'm going to talk about the fascinating life cycle of our native plants, because the life of our native wild plants is very different from domesticated crops and other garden plants. And central to Wild Seed Project's work is to really demystify the native seeds and the growing of native plants. So a lot of the practices that even a really good organic gardener has learned don't translate to the needs of our wild plants. So today what I'm going to do, I'm going to walk you through looking at about 20 different wild plants and their flowering, pollinators, seed ripening, and how you handle the seeds. Then I'm going to show you simple outdoor seed propagation methods that anybody can do without expensive facilities. Before we get started on the individual species, I want you to just look carefully at my slide here at these 3 different wild plants. On the left is the Turk's cap lily. And like all of our native lilies, they have these beautiful golden seeds. In the middle, those black seeds are witch hazel. And on the right is milkweed. And so just to remind everyone from your high school biology class what a seed is. A seed is a embryonic, a baby plant with a root, shoot, and then some food that can often be starchy or oily. That's what animals, including us, often like to eat. And then they have a seed coat that's basically a protective cover. A seed forms in the ovary of the mother plant, and that mature ovary can be dry and thin and papery or woody, or it can be a thick and fleshy fruit. So you take a native wild fruit that all of us know, though, say the Maine wild blueberry. The blueberry that you're eating is actually the ovary of the mother plant, but those seeds inside, they are the offspring. They represent the next generation. And the seeds are the result of sexual reproduction, which is between 2 or more individuals and results and each individual being genetically unique. So you look at this picture and all the seeds just in this image here. Each one of those seeds is a unique individual, the same way that you and I are each different and unique. And it's this genetic diversity that all species need to be able to change to changing environmental conditions, which we're facing rapidly right now. Okay, so now we're going to move into looking at the different species, and I'm going to start with the more challenging ones to propagate, the spring, mostly the spring woodland wildflowers. They're the species that give native plants, the reputation that they're difficult to propagate. And then we'll move into the more easy ones to grow. So don't get overwhelmed in the beginning that you'll never be able to figure out how to do this. And so many of our spring wildflowers are ephemeral, which means they come up early in the spring and they complete their life cycle, by almost now or within the next month or so. In this picture, you're looking at trout lily. That's the yellow flowers with those bright green long mottled leaves, and then the white flower is the wood anemone. Well, trout lily is one of our native woodland lilies, and it's pollinated by early spring bees. The little white anemone also has small flies that pollinate it. After the flower goes by, the plant starts to go dormant and a seed pod starts forming where those bright yellow flowers are, and it is about 1/2 inch long by wide and green and oval shaped. And the seeds ripen about 6 weeks from now. And by the time those seeds are ripened, the whole plant has disappeared and the pod is just this wilted tan stem laying in the leaf litter. And when it ripens, the pod splits open and there are these small tan seeds inside, and they have little fleshy protrusion on them that's attractive to ants. Ants come and collect the seed because they want to eat that fleshy protrusion. They carry it off to their ant nest, eat the little fleshy part, and then deposit the seeds in their compost pile, basically. And those seeds will germinate after the second spring. So this is very typical of a lot of these slow growing woodland wildflowers, that the seeds have a double dormancy and they won't germinate until 2 springs later. So the flowers that are happening right now, it will be the spring of 2023 before they germinate. And then this species, it's 12 to 15 years from seed before it will you will get a flowering plant. So very slow reproduction. So you can see why these plants aren't widely available in the nursery trade. They're very slow to reproduce, and you have to know how to find and collect the seeds. And unfortunately, when you see this one for sale in a nursery, frequently it's been dug from the wild. The little white anemone on the left, that has a little cluster of green seeds that ripen also about a month or so from now, and they also are ant dispersed. Bloodroot, there's probably a fair amount of this in the woods in southwestern Connecticut. It's typical in deciduous forest, and it's another one of our early spring wildflowers. And after the flowers go by, it's pollinated by early spring bees and flies and other little insects. It gets these 2 to 3 inch long green kayak shaped seed pods. And I live in Portland, Maine, and my pods here, I'd say, are another week or 2 away from ripening and splitting. So once they're ripe on a population of this plant or a clump of this plant, within a couple of days, all of the pods will split. And within an hour of them splitting, the ants descend and collect the seeds. They also have this little white fleshy protrusion that the ants like to eat. They carry them off, eat the fleshy part, which is high in proteins and fat, then deposit it in their under the leaf litter, which is like their compost bin. And that's the perfect place for these seeds to hang out over the summer. And if it's not a droughty summer, under the moist leaf litter lets the embryo is actually immature when the seeds pod ripens. And so it needs the warm summer weather under the leaf litter to finish maturing. Then that seed has to go through a winter cold period and it will germinate the next spring. If it's a dry summer, then that embryo doesn't finish the maturation process. It waits until it goes through a winter cold period and then needs the next spring moisture to finish maturing, and it will germinate the second year. Trillium, we've got, a handful of different trilliums native to New England. This is purple trillium, and this tends to bloom in Maine, and about, right after the flower goes by, it starts forming its pod, which you can see in this picture here. It's about 1 inch across. On this species, it's purpley red. On other species, it's green or sometimes bright red. And it's about 3 months after it blooms before the seed pod ripens. And when it does ripen, within 24 hours, it suddenly softens and falls off the plants. And here you can see it split open, and you can see that little creamy yellow part next to the brown seeds. That's the fleshy protrusion. That's called an elaiosome. And that's what the woodland ants are after. It's high in protein and fats. They like to eat it. And in the process of carrying it off and eating it, they then deposit the seeds under the leaf litter, the perfect place for those seeds to also hang out. And they will not germinate the next spring. They have to go through 2 winters and then will germinate. So the flowers from this year will germinate in the spring of 23. Usually in early to mid-May is when the seeds germinate. And a first year trillium plant will be about 1 inch tall with a single little leaf that's about 1/4 inch wide and 1 inch long. In the 3rd and 4th year, you'll get the small plant that's maybe 4 to 6 inches tall with the characteristic little 3 leaves of a trillium plant. And typically they're about 7 years before they're mature enough to start blooming. So you can see with this slow reproduction, these woodland wildflowers, they are always going to be challenging and slow to reproduce. I've grown thousands of them from seed. It's not hard to do, it's just slow. So most of what you see for sale in the nursery trade is unfortunately either poached from the wild, unless you've gotten it at a place who really knows how to propagate native plants. And, for instance, the Native Plant Trust Garden in the Woods, where I used to work, their nursery in Framingham and also out in Whately is a great place to get some of these plants. But these will never be widely available. And when you see these plants in the woods, they are old populations. When the land has been plowed for agriculture or grazed and turned into pasture, these, even if the forest has grown back, you won't find these slow growing woodland wildflowers in there, because between the slow dispersal by ants who can only carry them maybe 10 to 20 feet a year, and then if there's a road or a lawn or a housing development or paving or a city, these plants don't move easily across the landscape. Then there's other native wildflowers that are difficult, if not impossible, for humans to propagate and reproduce. And this is pink lady slipper. It's not a rare plant in the acid woodlands of New England, but it's one of those wildflowers that's completely dependent on its relationship with mycorrhizal fungi in the soil for all aspects of its life cycle, for its seeds to germinate and for the plants to grow. So we've all heard the great stories in the media finally about the wood wide web, about the fungal relationships in the forest between the trees and all the other plants and the life in the soil. Well, that's true of all native plants in their wild habitat. All trees, shrubs, wildflower ferns, they all have fungal relationships. And some species have to have them or they can't grow. And that's true of the pink lady slipper. Other species, you can grow them without it, but they grow better with it. And so with the pink lady slipper, what happens when these bloom in the spring? So they're probably blooming in Connecticut now. They're pollinated by bumblebees. And remember, the pollinating insects, they're not trying to, help the plants get pollen from one plant to another. They're foraging. They're after nectar, which is a high value food. And they also like to eat pollen. So with this plant, the bumblebee comes and it has to climb inside that funny shaped flower down deep into the pouch where they're expecting to find the nectar in the bottom. And on their way down, they pass the pollen and it gets rubbed up against their hairy body. And when they get to the bottom, they find the lady slipper orchids actually don't produce any nectar. So they went through all this work and then they thought they didn't get anything. So they climb out and fly to another flower, and turns out bumblebees are smart. And after they visited a few flowers, they quickly learn that there's no nectar and they give up and move on to a different woodland wildflower that's blooming at the same time. So if you take a population of this plant, often only about 10% of the flowers will end up getting pollinated. Luckily, each seed pod has like 10,000 teeny dust-like seeds in it. So there's still plenty of seed to then, or they're wind dispersed, typically in the late fall or sometimes even over the winter. So the low pollination rate doesn't affect them producing enough seed. It's more the loss of habitat. So this is a wildflower that doesn't want to be tamed by people. If you've got it in your woods, appreciate it and protect it. Some of the other, it's very typical of the woodland wildflowers, like gay feathers might be blooming now, another little pink one, or Goodyear, rattlesnake plantain. All those they are dependent on this mycorrhizal relationship with the fungi in the soil, and nobody's really figured out how to commercially germinate and grow these plants. There's a few species of lady slipper orchids that can be propagated from divisions, and there are some laboratories that are growing them through tissue culture, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but that's not the sexual reproduction that produces the genetic diversity. So when you see this, just appreciate it. Don't think you're going to be able to propagate it. Okay, now I'm going to move into some ones that are not so slow to reproduce. This is Marsh Marigold. Used to be a very abundant wetland plant. It bloomed for about 3 weeks, usually in early May, and typically it's in roadside ditches and wet woods, swamps, marshes, stream sides. Pollinated by small native bees, and it's quite a pollinator magnet when it's in bloom, lots of little teeny bees. And then after the flowers go by, if you look below the yellow flowers, you'll see the green on the sort of right in the center lower part of the picture, the green seed pods starting to form. And as they ripen, it opens up, and you can see the picture on the far right where it looks star-shaped, and then it splits open and has all these little teeny bright green seeds. And so those seeds are ripe once the pod splits open. And if you're there, within a day or two of them ripening, you can collect them. And what they need to germinate is to be sown immediately on damp soil surface. So in the wild, in a wet area, streamside or wetland, they typically will fall under the plant where the water has receded, because it's now usually June some point, but the mud is still damp, and it's shaded by the leaves of either the forest or the ferns and other plants that have grown up around it. And those seeds landing on the damp mud will germinate within a month and grow throughout the summer. And you can do this in a pot and then have little plants to pot up later. And they usually, a few will bloom the second year, by the next year, and then a plant will really be mature by the third year, and they can live for a long time. Now, some of the other species that have seeds that must stay moist are our shrub viburnums, our native viburnums, and all our different native dogwoods, whether it's the big bract flowering Florida dogwood or the alternate leaf dogwood, like in the picture above here, or all our different shrub dogwoods species. They all tend to have these white frothy flowers that are really high value for teeny pollinating insects. And then after the flowers go by, usually in August and September, the fruits ripen. And in this picture on the bottom, the left is nannyberry viburnum. Those seeds aren't ripened yet. They start off green, then they turn pink, then they turn navy blue, and that's when they're ripe. The middle is high bush cranberry. Those tend to ripen in September. And then the right is the silky dogwood. So all our native shrubs with these fleshy fruit berries, those seeds also don't like to dry out. What you need to do is collect them when they're ripe, remove the flesh, pretend you're a bird. They're all designed to be dispersed by birds. So going through the bird's digestive tract. And typically if a plant has a fleshy fruit, you want to get the seeds out from inside it, that there's often a germination inhibitor in the seeds. It's designed to go through an animal's body. So you can mimic that. I put these in a Ziploc bag and start, squishing it and letting it ferment for a week or two, and then the flesh will rot out, and then you can just rinse them off and sow them immediately. And most of the viburnums and dogwoods, some of them will germinate the next spring, but more typically, they also have a double dormancy where they're 2 years to germinate. And the reason is that when the fruit is ripe, the embryo is immature on these plants, and they need usually at least 2 or 3 months of continued warm weather for that embryo to mature. Then it needs to go through a cold winter outdoors, and then it will germinate in the spring. So these same plants, if we lived in DC or South Carolina or Georgia, they would germinate the next spring, because when they ripen, they still have, several months of nice, warm, mild weather. But in New England, it's typically cold, getting already cooled off by September when these are ripening. And so they will wait 2 years to germinate. Now that's, people find that very inconvenient. However, these, most of our native plants have been around for, millions of years. They have figured out how to survive the ice ages, with massive shrinking and expanding of, where their ranges were. They know how to exist in our changing climate. And then all of our native nuts. This is American hazelnut. The nut is inside that green fleshy covering there. Oak trees, acorns, hickory nuts, butternuts, walnuts, beech nuts. They all have seeds that the seed must be sown and kept, immediately upon ripening. They can't be stored dry. They quickly lose their viability. With these nuts, it's mostly that it's the oils in them that can't tolerate the drying out. So what you do, with any of the native nuts, as soon as they fall from the tree, you've got to grab them, because you're competing with the blue jays and squirrels and all kind of other creatures who love the nuts. And let's say it's an oak tree, you can collect the nuts, and they sow them either right in the location where you want the tree to grow. Just go bury it 1 inch down in the soil. I find chipmunks and squirrels and rodents love these nuts too, so you've really got to protect them with wire. So if you do the acorn right in the ground, put a little piece of screen over top of it so it doesn't get dug up. If you decide you want to do them in pots first, you still need to do it all outdoors. And so you can just sow them right in a pot. The bigger and deeper the pot, the better. And then also you've got to protect them though with wire, and serious wire. You cannot leave a bowl of acorns or any of these nuts outside for 5 minutes without the squirrels finding them. So if you're not prepared when you find the nuts, put them in a Ziploc bag and put them in the refrigerator. So most of our native nuts, they're ripening in September and October. And get yourself set up before you sow them. They do have to have a winter outside. So you can't sow them in a pot and put them on your windowsill. You can, if you're not, you can keep them in that Ziploc bag with a couple moist leaves in it in the refrigerator, and wait and sow them in the spring. And with the leaf in there, a couple wet leaves in there, that will keep it moist enough, and the refrigerator temperatures is cold enough that it will think it had a winter outside. But the important thing is to protect all the nuts from rodents. Okay, now I'm going to move into the species that do have seeds that can be stored dry if you want. And this is Jack in the Pulpit. This is one of my favorite native woodland wildflowers. It's in the arum family. It's the northernmost, this is, it's the northernmost species in what's mostly a tropical family. So these come up really late in the spring. Here in Portland, they've just come up in the last week. They really wait till the weather warms before the plant even comes up, because again, most of this family lives in a warmer climate. And the flower so are either male or female. Most plants have flowers that have both male and female sex organs. That's the stamens and pistils. But occasionally plants have separate male or female flowers. Sometimes they're on the same plant. That happens with trees a lot. And then there are some species that have separate male and female plants, like everybody knows how hollies are like that. You have to have both a male and female to get the fruits. Well, with Jack in the Pulpit, the actual individual plant can switch back and forth from year to year. One year it can be male and next year it can be female. You can't tell when it's blooming because the flowers are in that bright green striped area below. So, the only way you can tell is you'd have to cut that open and look. But it's pollinated by little flies and they can climb in there. But you can easily tell a month after they've bloomed because it's only the female ones that start to produce the seeds, and they start off as these emerald green, shiny cluster of fruits. When they're ripe, the cluster is usually anywhere from 1 to 2 inches across, and when it's ripe, usually in late August, the emerald green shiny fruits turn to bright red, and then you can just collect the seeds right off that plant. I squeeze the seeds out, and you can let them air dry and just store them in a paper bag. And in a little bit, I'm going to walk you through how to actually sow the seeds. You can also just sow them right away. These ones, though, don't mind dry storage. So you can just hold on to them until you're ready to do your late fall seed sowing, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, another species that's challenging to collect the seeds, but the seeds are easy to handle, is all our violets. We have lots of great native violet species, and they're really important for early spring pollinators, and they're typically pollinated by different species of native bees. And we've got species that grow in sunny, dry environments, and then wet areas and shady areas. And if you look at the flower, you can see that flower in the middle that hasn't opened yet, and see how it's pointing down. Well, after that flower goes by, it forms a green seed pod that's about quarter of an inch to half an inch long by as wide. And when they are ripe, it switches from hanging down to pointing up, and then it splits open, and the seeds sometimes even spring off from the plant. Those seeds, when they're ripe, they're kind of goldeny brown, and they also have a teeny little fleshy protrusion that ants like. So woodland ants are another important dispersal of this species. However, you're lucky and get there and get the seeds. You can just store them in a paper bag and then sow them outdoors in the late fall so that they get a cold winter and they will germinate in the spring. One unusual thing with violets is they have a secondary strategy of producing seeds that are exact clones of the mother plant. So if you look at this image on the right side, that is in the middle of the summer. The violet plants produce another set of flowers that you never see. They actually burrow under the ground. They don't get pollinated. They're literally seeds that are a clone of the mother plant and ripen underground. And then when they're ripe, they come up and split and are carried off by ants. And why this plant, this is actually how peanuts are produced too. Peanuts, the flower, after it's pollinated above ground, it buries underground. Those aren't clones, but it all happens underground. And it must be that when these plants, they've had plenty of spring weather where it will rain for weeks on end. And so they don't get pollinated. So they've developed this secondary strategy to make sure they produce seeds every year. But again, those seeds are literally exact replicas of the mother plant. Then we've got a bunch of plants that are, the seeds are hard to collect because they spring off from the plant. This is wild geranium, and it's blooming now in the woods and meadows around Maine and in my garden here. And after the flower goes by, it produces this green cluster of 5 little seeds around a long beak. They're sometimes called crane. That's why geranium's common name is sometimes crane's bill. And then when they're ripe, and you can see the picture on the on the right, it turns from green to black, and that all happens within 6 hours and then springs off from the plant. So for me to collect these seeds, I have to collect my plants once or twice a day, because that's how much it happens over a couple-week period, where they just keep ripening and springing off the plant. But you've got to wait till they start to turn black and are ready. And then those seeds, you know, in the wild, they would land under the leaf litter and hang out under there, and then they'd go through the winter, and then they germinate the next spring. And I'll show you a picture of these as juveniles in a minute. Then some other ones that are challenging to collect are bluets. So this is a tiny little plant, maybe 2 or 3 inches tall, very common in meadows and sometimes scraggly lawns, especially wet lawns, sometimes in gravelly, rocky areas. And these can bloom for over a month. And after the flower goes by, they produce these, you know, little tiny seed pods that are maybe 1/8 of an inch across and tall at where the flowers were. And it's about a month after the flower finishes blooming. So people often proudly, when they have this plant in their lawn, mow around them and enjoy their blooming. But then as soon as the flower stops blooming, they mow them well before the seed ripen. And so mowing is one of the ways we are really setting back and wiping out our native species, where, you know, most people don't realize how long it takes from after a plant blooms till when the seed ripens. So for this one, you know, you really have to wait a month. And if you want to collect the seeds, it's not hard. It's just a matter of finding them. And then I take scissors and snip them off into a little white paper envelope, and they're tiny, tiny little seeds. And you can just store them in that white paper envelope and sow them outdoors in a pot later. And I'll show you how to do that. Okay, now I'm going to move into the species that are easy to collect and store the seeds dry and then sow. And many of them need a winter cold period outside. That's one thing that's different. Most of our native species, these seeds want to go through a winter cold period outside, which makes complete sense if you think about where we live and what the climate's like. So this is red columbine. This is blooming in Maine right now. Maybe you guys are already past this where you are. And after it's pollinated by hummingbirds and bumblebees. And after the flower goes by, you'll see an upright vase-shaped green seed pod with 5 parts to it. And then when the seeds are ripened, it turns tan and papery, and it splits, and you'll see lots of little brown seeds or almost blackish brown seeds inside. So a plant like this with many flowers will produce thousands of seeds. And they don't all disperse at once because the pod is upright. They tend to shake out over kind of a couple of weeks. So it's pretty easy to collect some seeds from this and then save them in a paper bag. If you have it in your garden, it's a great one to let it seed around, because what this plant in the wild, where you see this plant, is in rocky ledge. It can be on the coast, growing in full sun above the sea, getting splashed by the ocean, and it can be in really rich, deciduous forest with high nutrients, where some of the most pristine woodland wildflowers are, but it always is on ledge. And the reason is it needs well-drained soil, and the crown does not like to be buried under mulch. And that's what most gardeners are putting so much bark mulch everywhere that this plant hates that. So, you know, in a garden, it's great in stone paving or on a rock wall or on sloped ground where it doesn't get buried under the mulch. This is our native iris, blue flag iris, Iris versicolor, pollinated by bumblebees, sometimes hummingbirds too. And this tends to bloom for about a week or two. In Maine here, it's usually early June. And after the flower goes by, it starts forming a seed pod that is green and eventually 2 to 3 inches long by about 1 inch wide. And the pod is ripe in late September. So June bloom, late September ripening. Now this plant is used to be really abundant in roadside ditches, wet meadows, stream sides, but all our roadside ditches and a lot of our meadows, people mow them way too early for seeds to ripen. When these seeds ripen, what happens is that green pod turns sort of tan and papery and splits at the top, and one pod can have, you know, a couple hundred seeds inside. And you can collect those seeds and store them dry and then sow them outside a little bit later. But, you know, even though it's a perennial species, if it gets mowed one year, you know, it will still come back the next year. But because we mow every year mid-season, this is really setting back the reproduction of our native plants. And these, even though many native perennials will live for, you know, anywhere from 3 to 50 years, you still prevent their reproduction. So mid-season mowing is death to a lot of the reproduction of a lot of our native plants. Wild strawberry. This is one of my favorite native edibles and ground covers, and it's blooming now, at least where I am here in Maine. And then about 3 weeks to a month later, you get the little ripe fruits. And this is a really tough native ground cover. It doesn't need, it's tolerant of sun or shade, although of course it will have more fruits and flowers in the sun. Dry soil, doesn't need much extra nutrients. So how I get the seeds from this plant is I collect the fruits when they're ripe and I smear them on cardboard, smush them out, and let it dry overnight, and then I can fleck the seeds off, and they can be stored dry in a little paper bag. And they do need some cold weather to germinate, but only about 10 days. So they can either be sown outdoors in the late fall, winter, or as late as late March. They just need, a good 10 days guaranteed below 40 degrees before the seeds will germinate. Our different native milkweeds. This is the swamp milkweed. All of our native milkweeds are top pollinator plants. So obviously the milkweeds are all famous for supporting the monarch butterfly. And the butterfly, they don't have to have, they drink nectar from lots of different flowers. What they need from the milkweed is the foliage, because that's where they lay their eggs. And that's what the baby caterpillars need. If they don't get the milkweed foliage, they can't eat and they end up dying. But all of our native milkweeds are incredible pollinator plants. And you can see on this picture, that's a fritillary butterfly and one of our native bees. And I particularly like this picture because you can see how hairy that bee is. And that's one characteristic of our native bees that's different from the honeybee. Most of our native bees are really hairy. The honeybee has more short trim hairs, and it's that hairiness that makes them really effective at pollinators, that the pollen gets stuck on their body and they're really good at carrying it from one plant to another. And so, for instance, my milkweeds, when they bloom, they're covered with all these different butterflies and bees and even other pollinating insects. But what I have always found interesting, when a monarch shows up, I think the monarchs are a little bit of a bully because the other butterflies fly away, like they're scared of the monarch. So the milkweed, most people are familiar with what a milkweed pod looks like. So they're typically blooming in, late June, July up here in Maine. And the pods, though, aren't ripe till the swamp milkweed ripens before the common milkweed, till late September or even well into October. So again, often where milkweed's growing in meadows, people are mowing it before those seeds can ripen. And so the milkweed seeds, they also germinate much better when they've had a winter cold period outside. So sowing them outdoors in the fall or early winter, and when all the people were busy, school groups were trying to sow milkweed seeds, I was getting a lot of teachers calling saying they weren't germinating, and it's because they were trying to do it indoors in the classroom under lights in warm weather, and they need that winter cold period. Bunchberry, this is still a common wildflower in Maine, although it's really a circumboreal plant, which means it grows in the northern hemisphere. So as the climate warms, this one will even be moving north, and I'm sure soon out of southern New England, but even eventually, sadly, out of Maine. But these fruits ripen in usually early August, and you can just collect them and squeeze the seeds out, and they're really easy. This is one that really likes bark mulch. Rotted bark mulch mixed with sand is the perfect growing medium for this one. And if you sow them either right away after cleaning the seeds, or you can store them dry and then sow them outdoors in November or December, they will germinate in late spring. Mine have just germinated here. Cardinal flower, our native lobelias. So cardinal flower in the wild, it's a wetland plant, often in wet woods, stream sides, wetlands. And this picture here I like because it shows really the perfect place for this to be growing and flowering and reproducing. And so after these are hummingbird pollinated, after the flowers go by, usually, let's see, if they're flowering in July, it's usually September when the seeds start ripening, and they flower from the bottom to the top. And so the same thing happens with the seed ripening, and they get these little 1/4 inch across green seed pods that turns tan, and each one will have lots of teeny little brown dust-like seeds. And where those seeds want to land is on damp mud. So if you look at the backside of the stream, that damp mud in the shade, that is the perfect plant for this species to reproduce. And they do need at least a month or 6 weeks of winter cold weather to germinate. This is a really quick native plant to grow from seeds. Sometimes they'll even bloom the first year. Unfortunately, a lot of the cardinal flowers that nurseries sell are hybrids between either our native cardinal flower and our native blue lobelia, or between our native cardinal flower and some of the tropical lobelias. And they're still marketed as being great pollinator plants, but that has been, there were some great studies done on the different cultivars and hybrids of lots of our native herbaceous plants by Annie White at UVM, and where she literally measured the nectar and pollen in them. And typically they produce less than 10% of the nectar or pollen of the straight species. So if you think all of our native insects and our native birds, they're all stressed. So you take a hummingbird flies to the straight species and has a feast of nectar. It flies to one of the cultivars or hybrids, and it's getting 10% of the nectar it needs. So it's having to work 10 times harder to do its feeding. This is, it's almost a cruel trick we are playing, where we're planting these plants that are not supporting them the way they need to be. So plant the straight species. Here's another really easy native wetland plant to grow. This is blue vervain, a kind of wetland, wet meadow species. It blooms in the summer. It's a great bee and butterfly plant. And then, so it's usually blooming in Maine in late July, maybe a little earlier for you, maybe early August. And then the seeds ripen in mid-October. So once again, what usually happens people have mowed the roadside or their meadow long before the seed ripened. So this is one of the reasons our native plants, especially the meadow species, are just, retreating more and more every year. Really easy to collect these seeds. Once they ripen, all you have to do is put your hand under the dried seed pod, and you'll see these little brown elongated seeds will fall off. You can just collect them in a paper bag and then sow them outdoors later in the fall. Then we do have some species of northern plants that don't actually have to go through a cold winter for the seeds to germinate. They need no pre-treatment. So you could, in theory, still sow them now. And so like the coneflowers, like black-eyed coneflower here, Rudbeckia hirta, common roadside and meadow species in dry areas, or all our different asters. This is New England aster here. These, New England aster is one of the last seeds that I collect. I don't collect those seeds until early to mid-November. They tend to start blooming in Maine in the second half of September, bloom all through October. Really important plant for the late season bees and migrating monarch butterflies and other species, but the seeds ripen really late. So again, it's the mowing before the seeds ripen that's not good. Black-eyed coneflowers, same things. Those are blooming, usually starting in late June, all through July into August, and then the seeds start ripening late September, all through October. Black-eyed coneflower is one of the few native perennials that will actually bloom the first year from seed. Most of these, almost all of our wildflowers are perennials. We don't have that many annual species that are native in northern temperate climates. A couple that you might know of that are annuals are jewelweed. That's an annual actually, and it's our native impatiens. And Burke or wild cucumber, that's another annual, but most of our wildflowers are perennials. And so they don't typically bloom until the second year, or with the slow growing woodland ones, it can be many years. But black-eyed coneflower, if you need instant gratification, Rudbeckia hirta is the one for you. So now I want to give you a little cautionary tale about our native plants and the modern nursery trade. Because in the nursery world now, cloning is the norm. Most plants aren't grown from seed anymore, and clone plants are the opposite of genetic diversity. And my cautionary tale is related to the story around purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea. So that's a prairie wildflower that stretches in the wild into upstate New York and western Pennsylvania, not quite into New England, so it's not a New England native. But if any of you have been gardeners or herb gardeners for decades, this plant, started appearing in people's gardens in the 70s, who were especially herb growers. This as a really great, tough native perennial. And this picture, this is a wild Echinacea, and it's very, typically the wild plant is anywhere from 2 to 4 feet tall. The petals can be anything from pale, pale pink to deep pinky purple. And they're pollinator magnets. And after they go by, after they've been pollinated by bees and butterflies, later in the fall when the seeds ripen, they are a magnet for birds who come and land on them and eat the seeds. So really great plant, really great drought tolerant plant. Well, when I was the propagator at Garden in the Woods in the 90s, in the early 90s, this plant won the Perennial Plant of the Year award from the Perennial Plant Association. And since that time, lots of breeding has gone on with Echinacea. So we have about a dozen North American Echinacea species, all mostly prairie plants, a lot grown from sort of Texas and the Southeast all the way out through the prairie states. And so they've done a lot of hybridizing where they've crossed 2 different species. And if you go to a garden center now, you'll see all these unusual colors and forms. We've got, there's a yellow species that has, created these ones that are getting orange and pink. And if you look at the one in the middle with the sort of pom-pom look, that's where the flowers have mutated, the, sex organs, the stamen and pistils have mutated and look like little tiny petals. So double flowers, like when you see a double flowered rose or peony, what has happened is the sex organs have mutated and they look like petals. So there's no nectar, there's no pollen, they just stay looking like that. And that's one of the reasons gardeners love them. They seem to bloom and bloom and bloom, but there's nothing for nature. There's no nectar or pollen for the bees, and there's no seed ripening. So these plants are evolutionary dead ends. And so most now of all these new forms of Echinacea, they're mostly being produced by a big grower in Texas. A lot of them aren't hardy. They're all being cloned in a process called tissue culture. And that's where they, breed them, and then they take some little stem tissue and culture it out in a petri dish. And then they prick those out and grow them in these massive greenhouses where there's millions of genetically identical individuals. And that's a massive greenhouse like that has a lot of pest and disease problems. So they use all kind of nasty chemicals. To me, this is not what we want to have happen to our native plants. We don't want to start changing them for a certain look. Now, there's nothing wrong with you thinking these new forms are beautiful, but if we're looking to plant more native plants in our landscapes because we're trying to support nature, if we start choosing traits in these plants that we like, we are working against nature and not helping these plants. And cloning is the opposite, in my opinion, of ecological, creating resilient plants that will be able to, adapt to future needs. Here's another example of a great native shrub. This is Diarvilla lonicera, yellow bush honeysuckle. This is it when it blooms it starts blooming like in usually early June, can bloom for a month or 2. It's pollinated by bumblebees. After it's been pollinated, the flowers turn reddish, so you can tell which ones the bees have visited. And if you look at that little purple edging on the leaf, a lot of native, particularly woody plants, when they first leaf out in the spring, they have a purplish or reddish cast to them. So the picture on the left, that is this Diarvilla. Right within the first week of it leafing out in the spring, it has this purplish cast, and that chemical is to repel herbivores. So deer, bunny rabbits, insects, anyone who would want to eat it, that chemical tastes bad, but it quickly goes away, and then the leaves turn green because the plant needs to photosynthesize. Well, if you go to a garden center now, you see tons of red-leaved forms of plants. And indeed, somebody has found a red-leaf form of this yellow bush honeysuckle, and they probably didn't breed it. It was probably just a naturally occurring mutation. But that red, it stays red all season. And so remember, our native plants, a huge part of their value is not just the flowers for the pollinator, but it's that they serve as host plants for all kind of native insects, particularly the lepidoptera, the butterfly and moth. So everybody gets with the milkweed, how that supports the monarch butterfly. Well, all of our native species do that with the butterfly and moth family. And in fact, I called Doug Tallamy, and he said there's 5 or 6 lepidoptera that use this plant as a host plant. And he said they hate the red. They will not touch it if it's a red leaf form. So don't choose these new cultivars of our native plants that are red foliage forms. They will not support nature. So how do we solve this problem? What do we do? And it's what I founded Wild Seed Project for. Wild Seed Project is all about getting people to, appreciate and grow the seeds, sow the native seeds, not save the native seeds. I often get people saying, to me, oh, I'm so glad you're saving the native seed. I'm like, I'm not trying to save the seeds. I'm trying to create a grassroots movement of lots of people sowing the native seeds and supporting the nurseries. You know, if you're not going to do it yourself, then support the nurseries who are sowing the seeds. So people always want to learn about collecting the seeds. And I say, that's great, but that comes after you learn to sow the seeds, because we don't want a lot of people out there collecting the seeds if you don't know how to handle the seeds. And I just walked you through all the, you know, unusual seed ripening and handling, and you can easily kill, you know, our native plants aren't abundant out there anymore, and we don't want to be grabbing the seeds and not using them or collecting them when they're not ripe or not handling them properly, and then they die. So a big part of our mission is making the seeds available, and we have about 75 species that me and my team of volunteers all hand collect, clean, and process and sell through the website. All the seeds are stored in glass jars in the refrigerator, unless they're one that has to stay moist, in which case we handle that correctly. I've been doing this for decades, starting when I was apprentice at the Arnold Arboretum with Jack Alexandra, the propagator there when I was in college. You know, I have grown hundreds, if not thousands, of different native species from seed. You know, this is not rocket science. A lot of us could be doing this. And so I'm really dedicated to inspiring lots of people to get out there and try sowing the native seeds. And the way you do it is completely different from what you've been taught, especially if you're a gardener and you grow vegetables or common annuals. Right now is not the right time to sow most of the native seeds. It's the late fall or winter. And it can all be done with simple, setting up a simple outdoor seed propagation area. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, a lot of people want to just take the seeds and broadcast them in their garden or in their landscape. And there's a lot of reasons why I don't want you to do that. You know, when you broadcast seed, and let's say you even prepared the site properly, which means you got rid of all the weed seeds there, which that's a whole nother different story. You know, any soil has tons of seeds in it, most of which are exotic annual weeds. You know, they grow way faster than our native plants. So the only way to broadcast seed is if you've prepared the site. But also, typically when you broadcast seed, you're lucky if 1 to 5% of those seeds germinate and become future plants. The life of a seed out in the landscape, you know, a lot of them get eaten by birds or rodents or blow away or land somewhere where they're not going to germinate. So what I like to have people do is to sow the seeds in pots. And you can, you know, get some good organic potting soil, some compost-based potting soil that will have lots of different microorganisms in them. That I prefer that to the sterile peat moss potting soil that has been inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. Just get some good organic potting soil with compost in it. That works really well. You can use 4, 6, 8-inch little pots. These are 4-inch pots. You can sow the seeds really thickly. And you need to use, you can't use those fiber pots or peat pots because they don't last long enough. You know, these are perennials, they need to stay in the pot for longer. Use a plastic label. Wooden labels also won't last long enough. You can use pencil, and then you can reuse these pots over and over again. You can also sow them in clay pots really, really well. If you want to do it in a nursery frame where you fill like a cold frame instead with potting soil, you got to take the lid off. You don't need the cover. Use good organic potting soil, but you can't just sow them right out in your garden. Too many weed seeds. So the time of year to do this for most species is late fall and early winter. So by late fall, I mean after Thanksgiving. And you know, the ideal time is between Thanksgiving and early to mid-January. And so you can wait till you've finished all your other outdoor gardening chores and hiking. Wait till the weather's really cold and raw and you're gotten through the holidays, I sow all the seeds that we sell. I do a big annual sowing, usually around New Year's Day. So we do it indoors, and then I carry these pots outside. You put them somewhere outside in the shade. This is very important. And where the ground is flat, so that the seeds don't wash off when it rains. And then you cover them with wire mesh. You can use an old wire screen. If you're planting nuts, you can't just lay the wire and cross on top. You really have to make a rodent-proof frame. But with all the other species, if you just cover it with a wire mesh, that will prevent the cat and squirrels from going in there. And then you leave them out there. And no matter what the weather is all winter, these seeds, they like that. They like the snow, they like the rain. They don't mind that it was 40-degree one day and then the temperature dipped down to 20 and then it snowed 2 feet and then it's late January and there's a midwinter thaw and it's 45 degrees again and then it rains and then it freezes and it snows again. Our native seeds need that freeze and thaw to break up the heavy seed coat. And then what happens is they start germinating in early spring, and it's amazing how early. Some of those double dormancy plants, the woodland wildflowers, they start germinating in March when it still regularly dips below freezing. Asters, goldenrod, penstemon, they're all germinating in early April when the temperatures are still really raw and cold. In fact, that cold, damp, raw weather that farmers hate because all their crops are tropical is perfect for our native seeds. Here's a picture. I just took this week of all the seed flats where they are here in Portland, Maine this time of year. So you can see these are just 4-inch square pots. You can see I've got anywhere from 50 to 150, even 200 seeds per pot. Native seeds are like teenagers. They like to all be crowded together. They germinate better that way. Oh, I forgot to mention, I cover the seeds with sand instead of with potting soil. That works really well too. It helps keep them splash out. And so then what I like to have people do is, instead of dividing these up now and planting in their garden, you cannot do that now. It's already dried out, the competition in your garden, these plants still need care over the summer. So the most low maintenance thing to do is to take that whole pot, tip it out and put it in a much bigger pot, an 8-inch or a gallon size pot. If it's milkweed or aster, you can put it in an even bigger pot, and those seedlings will just grow together, they'll push apart and put down a deep root system. And then in September, you can divide them up and plant them out in the garden. So these are 4-inch square pots. In 1 square foot, you've got 9 different species and hundreds of seedlings. This is a very efficient way to produce a lot of plants. This is the wild geranium. So typical of wild seeds, some species, they won't all germinate that first year. And so this is a 2nd-year pot of wild geranium seedlings. And so you can see the little round leaves. Those are the ones that just germinated this 2nd spring, and those bigger geranium leaves, they had germinated the year before. Again, that is a great strategy in a wild plant, that you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and germinate all at once. Think of the weather we've had this spring, where I don't know about you in Connecticut, but man, it has barely rained here in all of April and May. A lot of seeds that have germinated in the wild this year are not going to grow. They're going to shrivel up and die. So when you don't, these native seeds, they have seeds that have strategies to deal with climatic variation. These are jack-in-the-pulpit seedlings. So they wait. In fact, I just saw my first one germinated this morning, because this is the first warm day we've had. Being a tropical plant, these wait and germinate once the weather's warm. And so this is like 30 seedlings in this little 4-inch pot. So again, I just take that whole pot and put it in an 8-inch pot to grow for the rest of the summer. And then you divide them up and plant them out in the fall. This is silky dogwood. You know, there's about 50 seedlings in this 8-inch pot. So this picture was taken in early June last year. I then took that 8-inch pot and put it in a 2-gallon pot. And then I had 2-foot tall silky dogwood seedlings. You could plant an instant hedge. And so you have the whole summer to prepare your site. So basically, it's the opposite of what lots of gardeners have learned. You've got to retrain yourself with the native seeds and think of late fall and winter is the time to sow the native seeds. You know, our native plants are really losing their place in our world. I still have my old Newcomb's Field Guide when I studied plant ecology in college in 1980. And when I go back and look at the description of the different native plants, and they'll list them as common or abundant or frequent, and so many of the ones that were back then just aren't anymore. You know, we need a lot of people increasing native plant populations. I want, you know, I hope lots of nurseries will start offering more seed-grown native plants, but you can also help make this happen. You know, it is really rewarding to grow a plant from seed. It's a whole different way of experiencing a plant. You know, you're nurturing it from babyhood. You'll learn to recognize those plants in the wild. And Wild Seed Project, we are a nonprofit organization. We have a beautiful website with tons of great free information on it. We also last year created a pledge to rewild, you know, launching off Doug Tallamy's data about, you know, if landscapes don't have a minimum of 70% native vegetation, then there's not enough host plants to support, you know, the pollinators and Leptoptera and the birds and all that cycle of the ecosystem. So go check out our pledge to rewild. When you sign that, we walk you through a pathway of learning where you get all this great content on how to make a native meadow, native ground covers, native vines, lots of different topics. We also are new this year. Instead of producing our annual magazine Wild Seed, we just produced a little pocket guide to native trees with 30 different species, you know, where they grow in the wild, how they do in the landscape, how to sow the seeds. So I hope you'll take a look at that. And I'm happy to answer if anyone has questions, because I know I covered a lot of information, but I really hope you'll all go visit our website and consider joining. You'll get a copy of our new tree guide as a benefit of membership. We also have these great member question and answer Zoom call-ins once a month. That's a great way to connect with other people and get to ask me and Anna Fielkoff, my program manager, different aspects of growing native plants. So thank you.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the audience. There are a few in the Q&A I've got for you. First question. I collected some seeds from the Dutchman's breeches and wondered how to plant them in my woods. Thank you for this delightful, informative talk.
Great, that's a perfect example of why you shouldn't collect seeds till you know how to handle them. So Dutchman's breeches, those seeds have to be sown right away. So if they're dried out, it kills them. I mean, I'm presuming you just collected them because I would guess they're just ripening now in Connecticut. So quick, go sow them right away in a little pot like I showed you. If you have the plant in your garden, you could also make a little circle around the mother plant and sow the seeds in a circle around that. But like I said, those seeds, if you collected them and either left them in your car or just even on your counter, they will die. So I don't know how long ago you collected them, but hopefully it was yesterday and you're going to sow them right now. So sow them in a pot with good organic potting soil covered with sand, put them in the shade, and hopefully they will germinate next spring. But all those spring ephemerals, they have seeds that can't dry out.
Okay, is anyone working on having nurseries label correctly their species, straight, cultivar, hybrid, I notice American Prairie brand being misreading on their labeling.
What brand was you saying?
American Prairie brand?
Yeah, I don't know that brand. So yes, it's a big problem. Go read on our website. We've just updated our nursery listing of ones that we know about that we recommend. And we also have a great blog called How to Navigate the Nurseries, the kind of questions to ask. And it's a big problem, because most nurseries now are more like the supermarket. They're not propagators anymore. They're just buying in. In fact, all these cultivars and clones, you're not allowed to, a lot of them are patented. You're not allowed to propagate them. So they have to buy them in from these mass producers who control everything. So there's a lot of misinformation. I do think one of the things I really outlined in that, I really recommend everyone read that How to Navigate the Nurseries, because nursery work is hard. This is a really hard time of year to go speak to your nursery. They are flat out. Go on a pouring rainy day when they're not busy to ask them the questions. But it is a big problem. There's so much misinformation. The best time to ask them is in, right now, the window we're in right now is the hardest time to ask them. But you know what? There's a lot of great native plant sales happening this month and next month. Go support those right now. And then come midsummer and fall and winter, that's the great time to really talk to your nurseries when they're not so busy. Because they are, go to a nursery on a sunny day, they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And it's a hard business in the north. You have to do most of your sales in a 1 month period. Think what that feels like. But it is a problem.
Okay, does Penstemon Husker Red not support native pollinators because of red leaves?
Yes, so the bees can still visit the flower, but the butterflies and moths that use it as a host plant, yes, they don't like that purple foliage. They can't eat it. So let's pretend somebody made a cultivar of milkweed with purple foliage. What would happen is if the monarch laid their eggs on it, the eggs would hatch and they'd go to eat it and the caterpillars would go, bleh, it tastes terrible. That's what that red foliage, the caterpillars won't eat it. So yes, like I said, the flowers haven't been messed up on Husker's Red, but the purple foliage is what does not support the butterflies and moths, which are a huge part of the food web. That's what baby birds eat, caterpillars. That's their primary food this time of year.
Okay, once the native seeds have germinated in the pot, do you move the pot into the sun?
If it's a sun-loving species, yes. The reason I like to have all the seed flats in the shade before they germinate is once the weather warms up and it's sunny weather, in one day the pot can dry out, particularly if you don't work at home. And so when people fail with native seeds, there's two things that happen. Either the whole pot dried, there's nothing worse for a baby seedling than for it to start to germinate and then it dries out. So if it's in the shade as it's germinating, it's much less likely to dry out. If it's in the sun, it can dry out in a couple hours. The other way, when people don't have success, sometimes they bury the seeds too deeply. And that's where sand is much more effective at covering the seeds. It lets light through. Most seeds need light. Now, there is a new problem with our changing climate that I'm encountering, which is these torrential rains can make seeds splash out. So the sand helps with that, but sometimes teeny dust-like seeds are getting splashed around more because, we're getting these rainstorms that are so torrential. But any sun-loving species, once it germinates, yes, you can move it into at least half sun. And if you're home all the time, then it can be full sun. If you leave the house every day, it's better to only put it in half sun so you don't dry them out.
Okay, when can Solidago be collected?
So each species is different, but that's another late fall one, October, November. So late in the fall. And they get fluffy and come off from the plant.
Can you spread Trillium from plants in my garden?
You can, if I had Trillium in my, if you have Trillium in your garden, what you can do is, well, you know, if you're lucky, it will seed in on its own. The seed pod will drop and the ants will carry it off. You know, if you have an organic garden and haven't put chemicals that kills all the insects, you know, that will eventually happen on its own. It typically takes, with these woodland wildflowers in a garden, when somebody, you know, let's say somebody put in a woodland garden with, you know, with Trillium and wild ginger, that's another ant dispersed one. It takes about 5 years before you really start noticing them reproducing in the garden. But you could, yes, you could squeeze them out. I would make a, you know, little spot near the Trillium plant under the leaf litter and do it there and put a little label in it and cover it with a thick layer of leaves. But it will, if you've got a healthy environment, it will eventually happen on its own, but doesn't usually the first couple of years. I think, you know, you have to really mimic that forest soil, which means letting the leaves fall down. Leaf litter is really important for all of our native plants and for healthy soil.
This question is related to another question in the chat. Can you please repeat your website and also talk about printed materials that would support your presentation?
Yes, that's all. You can go to our website, go to the seed sale page, which will link you. So our website is wildseedproject.net. You know, just Google Wild Seed Project and we'll come up. And, you know, start on the home page. You'll see the pledge to rewild. I think the Navigating the Nurseries blog is on the home page right now. You can see the link to the seed sale page right there. You'll see the link to our native tree guide there. You'll see the link to membership. But if you go, you know, under the navigation bar at the top to learning, you'll see all of the different, you know, writings and free resources we have. Then we have another bar that lists all our publications. You know, our website is like a huge book. There's so much information. One of the nice things when you sign the pledge to rewild, we'll kind of send you on a pathway of learning, but there's lots of propagation information on there. We've also had great writing in back issues of Wild Seed. Here's, you know, last year's issue, different propagation stories and seed sowing stories too. So there's so much information on our website. It's really beautiful too. We have lots of great pictures. You can see my garden in Portland here. It's the picture on the left. That's in the fall. That's an urban garden. Picture on the right is my old garden when I lived in a more rural area. That's my health strip right out front there. We have a really valuable resource in our website that I hope everybody will go visit. So wildseedproject.net.
Okay. Could native seedlings, seeds sown in January that are ready to be transplanted in the fall, be put in larger pots to overwinter for planting the following spring?
Yes, you can. The only thing, it's different when you overwinter plants as opposed to seeds. The seeds are just outside in the weather. When you have plants in a pot, you have to insulate them because you think they would normally be in the ground where their roots are in the soil and maybe just their stems are above ground. So what you can do, if you have an unheated shed, you can move them in there, or you can just cover them with a thick layer of leaves. Or lately, what I like to do is, you know, those brown paper leaf bags that everybody fills with leaves and sends off to the dump. Well, just buy those leaf bags and cover your little nursery area with layers of them. That works really well. And you don't do that until it freezes. So it's usually not till, you know, well into December before we do that. The other thing you could do when you go to our website is sign up for our e-newsletter. I mean, I hope you'll all join, but even if you just sign up for our e-newsletter, then you'll get every couple of weeks, you'll get, you know, news and things to do now. But you can do that. The other risk of overwintering is you can have damage from voles and rodents. So if you know where it's going to go and you can plant them, do, but I overwinter pots every year. And I have the traditional nursery way of doing it is using this white styrofoam blanket with white plastic on top that kind of mimics snow. But then they use either mouse traps or mouse poison underneath, because rodents are a huge problem for nurseries with all the overwintered plants. Well, and I never used the mouse poison, but since I've switched to the brown paper bag, because it lets moisture through, it's wet, I see much less rodent damage because they're looking for a dry place to make their nest.
Okay, can you recommend wild plants that can resist the garlic mustard in my wooded area? I'm trying to replace that. Thanks so much. Very interesting.
Yes, our native wild ginger, Asarum canadensis, is great. And the white wood aster and the blue wood aster and the large leaf wood aster also are great. The woodland goldenrod, Solidago sacea and Solidago flexicalis. If you go to our seed sale page, I've picked out the asters and goldenrods. Those are the seeds I sell that make nice garden plants. And the woodland goldenrods, the blue stem goldenrod and the zigzag goldenrod, the two that I sell really are excellent shade garden plants, and they would outcompete it.
Okay, what is the best strategy to propagate New Jersey tea?
So those seeds need a winter cold period outside. So collecting the seeds, they actually kind of spring out from the plant. So after it blooms, you need to watch them. And as soon as you see the capsules turns tan and they're little brown seeds inside, you can just collect those seeds in a brown paper bag and then sow them outside like I showed you on New Year's. And my pot of seedlings is just starting to germinate. They wait till heat happens. And because today is the first day we've had any heat in Maine. And so there's some plants, many of the seeds germinate in early spring, but there are always some that wait till the heat, and that's Jack in the Pulpit, Bunchberry, and the grasses wait till it's hotter, and New Jersey tea does too. But it's not hard, but those seeds need the freeze and thaw. A lot of traditional gardeners like to stratify their seeds in the refrigerator, but that doesn't have the freeze and thaw. It's the freeze and thaw that breaks up the heavy seed coat. These are wild plants that have a protective seed coat. All of our garden plants and vegetables, they've been domesticated. They've been selected over time to germinate quickly. They don't have a thick seed coat, but our native plants do. And the freeze and thaw solves all that problem. It breaks it up.
Okay, how long do native milkweed seeds remain viable? We have a lot of them from last fall and/or the fall before, but didn't get a chance to sow them due to unforeseen circumstances.
Ideally, we store all our seeds like that once they're dry in glass jars in the refrigerator. And in the refrigerator, they can stay viable for a number of years. In fact, I sowed some swamp milkweed seeds from 2016 this year, and they germinated as well as everything else. So if they've been at room temperature, they're probably still okay, but they need a winter. If you've got them right now, get them in a glass, put them somewhere cool for the summer and sow them outside next, late fall, and they'll probably be fine. But all of our seeds, they don't want to sit around at room temperature in your house. And it's the reason we sell our seeds through our website, not in stores. They don't want to sit on a rack in 70-degree weather, day after day in a garden shop. I keep them all in the refrigerator till we ship them out. But milkweed's pretty tough. I never throw seeds out, even ones that I think might not be good. I still go find somewhere to put them out.
Okay, here's someone who's involved with the Connecticut NOFA ecotype. Any advice on keeping large tracts of natives, producing seeds, and maintaining genetic diversity? Should portions be replaced with young stock?
So many of those species are long-lived perennials. So They are all, those ecotypes are all first generation wild plants that were planted in a bed. So, it's going to vary from species to species, but the seeds from those original plants, are good for as long as those plants will keep doing it. And many of them will do it for, some decades. Other species are short-lived. What could change over time is if you had a lot of seed drop on bare ground and had the new babies germinate, and those, it's possible if you were watering a lot, or you wouldn't know, because you wouldn't be adding chemicals or pesticides, but it's the offspring of them long time in cultivation could genetically change. But if you're talking about the original plants you planted, those potentially can live a long time.
Okay, I have a question that's for the library. Will this be recorded, and how can we access it? Yes, this has been recorded, and it will be in the environmental folder of our adult programming section on the Ridgefield Library's YouTube channel. It should be ready in about 2 or 3 days. So you can find this recording there. And we did talk about your website. Here's a question about how to find native plant sales in our neighborhood.
So, let's see, you're in Connecticut. I don't even know if there's a Connecticut Native Plant Society. So, you're not that far to hop up 91 and go up to Nasami Native Plant Trust Nursery in Whately, Mass. That's just, near Northampton. Grow Native in Cambridge has a plant sale happening soon. There's got to be ones happening down in your area. I can't remember. We just, like I said, go to our nursery listing on our website. We list some plant sales, but I cannot remember if we had a Connecticut one or not. Rhode Island Native Plant Society, which probably isn't too far from you, they have a great plant sale that's about to happen, I think. So go look at our nursery section on our website first. And ask NOFA too, because there's a big native plant movement in NOFA, Connecticut.
Okay, it looks like we have time for a few more questions before we wrap things up. If your shady overwintering spot is close to the house under the eaves, do you need to water the pots over the winter? How often?
I forgot to say that about an eave. Make sure you're not under the drip line. Pull out from it. So usually when I sow the seeds, say it's New Year's Day, and then take them outside, if it's the perfect situation is to be sowing them and it's a nice snowy day when you're doing it, and you carry it outside and the snow goes on and adds the moisture. If it's windy and not snowy or creepily warm, which it has happened shockingly on New Year's days, I might water them indoors and then carry them out, just because it just helps it settle down. But yes, you want the weather on it. So if you have a big, like people often say, can they put it on their screen porch? And I say, no, you actually want the weather on. I mean, you can put it there for, a week or something, but the idea is to have it exposed to the rain and snow. It's possible you could throw snow on top of it and that would do it. I never water them in the winter. But this year, like I said, we have had really dry weather. So I started watering my seed flats outside much earlier than usual, starting by the second week in April, because it never rained. Then I started watering them just lightly every couple of days. And being in the shade helps a lot. So it really depends how warm you are and how much sun you're getting and how much they're drying out. And that's also how you can judge when to move your little seed flat to a bigger pot, is if they're drying out quickly, that means the roots filled up that space already. So quickly get in a bigger pot.
Here's someone who wants you to give the name of the person at UVM who did studies on pollen and nectar content of plants again.
Annie White.
Okay, that's easy to remember.
So she's written for us in Wild Seed. If you go to the Grow Native in Massachusetts website. They give a great lecture series, and she spoke there a couple years ago, and that's a webinar. You should link that on your website, actually, to grow native stuff too. Because you can hear Doug Talamy's talks. Lots of great people have spoken there too.
Excellent. Okay, it looks like we have 4 more questions. Can you collect from black cohosh?
Yes, so black cohosh is interesting in that you can sow those now because they are seeds that can be stored dry, but they need warmth, then cold, then warmth. So in New England, the seeds of black cohosh, or at least in Maine and Massachusetts, they don't ripen until October. So by then it's too cold when they've ripened they need the warm first to finish that embryo development. I grew up outside of Pittsburgh. The black cohosh seeds there ripen in early August. So they then have 3 months of warm, and those seeds that's enough to mature it, and they will germinate the next spring. So you can those are one of the species that you can sow right now, and they will germinate next spring because they want the warm first, oddly, but they won't germinate this summer.
Okay, can you explain how to sow partridge pea in an open field?
Yes, so partridge pea is like the wild strawberry. It needs, 10 days to 2 weeks of cold weather. So if you wanted to sow them right now, you'd need to get bulk seed. I'd recommend going to Prairie Nursery or Prairie Moon Nursery. And you'd get those seeds and you'd put them in a Ziploc plastic bag and mix it with some moist sand or sawdust or vermiculite. And you'd need to put them in the refrigerator for a couple weeks to get the cold weather, let them soak up the moisture and be cold, and then you could go sow them.
Okay, I've seen what looks like phlox by the roadside. What's the procedure for gathering and propagating these seeds?
Those are probably not phlox. That's probably Dame's rocket is my guess. That's got to be common on roadsides.
Something else.
That's what's usually blooming right now. That's not a native plant. I don't know if it's listed as invasive. Is it kind of lavendery, purpley pink? It's very showy.
Purples and whites and pinks. Yeah.
Yeah, that's Dame's rocket. So that's a Eurasian species that I don't know if it's listed as an invasive plant, but I would consider it aggressive and wouldn't. Our native plants are the ones that need help.
Okay, for native plants in Connecticut, try the Northwest Conservation District next April. I believe the website is nwcd.org. And here's a final question here. Other than needing patience, is there a problem with dividing small seedlings instead of waiting?
Well, if you're very careful and conscientious and a good caregiver, you absolutely can. So with the different perennial species, like as a nursery, you would be dividing them and potting them up now. They take a week to recover from that. So let's say you have a bunch of New England aster. I would divide them into little clumps of anywhere from 5 to 9 seedlings per clump and pot those up, and then you will have really nice little bushy plants to either plant in your garden or share with other people. If you share them with other people, they're not getting one individual, so they will then have a little reproductive. But when you do divide them, you have to keep those plants in the shade for either a couple days or a week, because you're pulling the roots, you're disrupting them. So you can do it, but if you just take the whole clump and put it in a bigger pot, they don't even miss a beat. Versus if you divide them, they need a week to recover. And some handle it better than others.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our Q&A period here. Thank you so much for such an excellent and informative presentation today, Heather. I'm sure we had 75 people joined us for the presentation today. So we had
Well, I hope you all come visit our website and sign the pledge to rewild. And you should find it too, Lori. I think you
Yes.
would enjoy the educational process that it
Yeah.
unfolds to you.
And someone wondered if there was a place to visit you in Portland.
You have to wait till I do a field, a garden tour, which we might be able to do. Sometimes we have member gatherings here, and now that I am thinking of doing that now that we finally are coming out of the COVID crisis. So might happen. You become a member, you'll get a better chance, or if do a garden tour here. I do have, I live right in Portland. We've just been here a little under 7 years, and I'm rewilding. I've rewilded my whole yard. I started off with a little urban meadow in the backyard. Now I'm turning it into a mini forest, because my favorite plants are the woodland understory. And I get so upset with people, gardeners, who say there's nothing that grows in the shade. I'm like, we live in the great eastern deciduous forest bioregion. We have hundreds of understory species. And so I'm turning, my backyard is now becoming a forest. And so yes, there are chances too. And maybe it won't happen this year.
Great. Well, thank you for all the wonderful resources you've listed, and thank you so much for your presentation. I want to thank everyone for their lively questions in the chat and also in the Q&A. I think it was a great experience this afternoon. I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you again. Good evening.
Bye.
Bye.